Hi, and welcome everybody to this webinar hosted by the NEC. So good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. Today we're going to be talking through the new secondary option X29, which has been developed by the NEC to address the issue of climate change in contracts for works, services and supply. In terms of today's agenda, we're going to start with a bit of an introduction. We're then going to look at a background to the secondary option, why it was developed, how we came up with the sort of ideas behind it. We're then going to start to look at an overview of the option, some of its key elements, and then we'll work through some of the key aspects in its application, leaving plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. If you do have any questions, please type those into the chat box, or the question box, I should say rather, which is available within the application. So in terms of today's presenters, my name is Ian Heaphy. I'm a member of the NEC4 Contract Board. So I've been involved in drafting the 4th edition of the NEC contracts, and I was also fortunate enough to lead the development of this new secondary option. I'm joined today by Stacey Collins. Stacey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Ian. Hi, everyone. Great to see so many of you have joined us. I'm Stacey Collins, a partner in international law firm Pinsent Masons. I specialise in procurement and contracting solutions across the infrastructure, industrial and energy sectors. And I've been advising on projects involving climate change for over a decade, with particular expertise in procurement and contracts and setting them up to incentivise greener practices through the supply chain. And that and my knowledge of NEC led me to join the team that worked on X29.
Okay, so by way of introduction then, secondary option X29 was issued, is out there now as a consultative draft. It was released on the 4th of April. You can get access to that consultative draft through the NEC website. So neccontract.com, the details are on the slide. It's a free download, so anybody is welcome to access it. You just need to give your contact details, and we would encourage as many of you as possible to download it, to take a look at it. We've released it as a consultative edition because we want to get feedback from the industry about whether we've got it right. Does it achieve its aims? What can be done to improve it? Are there any issues in it which may constrain its use? We're very much looking for the industry to engage with us around that and provide us feedback. In particular, we're looking for you to advise us whether you think some of the terminology is right, some of the approaches we've adopted are right, given that it's a very broad part of a very broad issue to tackle, lots of different initiatives, and we want to make sure that we are hitting the right points within that document.
And do we think, Ian, that will be publishing some of the comments? How do you see the consultation playing out?
Okay, so with the secondary option download, there's also access to a set of guidance notes that provide some guidance on the secondary option itself, but also give advice on the consultation process. So what we've asked is people to sort of structure their responses in a certain way, so we can sort of collate common themes and then try and pick up issues that are coming through that are resonating with people that we need to address. I think we'll give some feedback on the consultation process when we finalise the drafts, which we intend to do ahead of the users group conference on the 16th of June. That's the point at which we intend to release the final version of the secondary option X29. And as part of that, we will provide some feedback around the consultation process. Just a word of note on that as well, the consultation process will end on the 13th of May. So we have some time, but not a huge amount of time in which to get your feedback. So as I say, please download it as soon as you're able to do so. Please share your thoughts and comments with us. So in terms of the development of the secondary option itself, it was led by a multidisciplinary team under the direction of the NEC and the NEC4 Contract Board, and supported by the ICE Carbon Project. So along with Stacey and myself, I'd like to give thanks to Richard Patterson, Procurement Specialist and Technical Principal Mott MacDonald, Sue Farr, Project Executive at the Environment Agency, and Veronica Flint-Williams, Contract and Risk Manager at the Environment Agency, who were part of the core team who developed this new secondary option. In terms of the consultative edition that is available for download, that has been drafted for use with the engineering and construction contract, the ECC, but the intent is that a version of X29 will be produced and made available for inclusion in all of the NEC4 main and subcontracts. So the idea being that once we formally release it in June, there'll be a version available so that all of the key players engaged in work services supply can have secondary option X29 included in their contracts. So whilst in today's presentation, in the consultative edition, it talks around client and contractor, it's going to apply equally to contractor and subcontractors, client and service providers, etc., depending upon the main or subcontracts you are using. Also, I touched on this a moment ago. Terminology is something we are keen to get feedback on. We've called X29 reducing the impact of the works on climate change. It's a little bit wordy. There's also no specific reference in that title to net zero or carbon. So we are keen to get feedback from the market as to the terminology, the wording we've used specific to climate change, because we recognize this is an evolving part of the market, lots of different initiatives, different groups sort of prioritizing different things. So we are keen to get some feedback around that.
Yeah, and perhaps if I can come in on that, Ian, it won't surprise many people that lawyers can spend a lot of time focusing on which words to use and what the meaning of those words are. And I think in the climate change arena, as Ian mentioned, there are many different terms being used interchangeably to cover elements of climate change. So, for example, net zero emissions, low carbon, greenhouse gas reduction, or even just net zero. And then when you consider wider factors that overlap, like sustainability and biodiversity, I think it was tricky to think about what the right terminology was to use. And I think as a group, we felt climate change was the broadest term and allowed the most flexibility. But of course, we want some feedback on that via the consultation, please.
Yeah, and I think that's a really valid point to make, that we've tried to make it as broad and as applicable as possible across all of these different sort of initiatives related to climate change. Hence, we haven't used some specific terminology, but as we've highlighted, feedback on that would be valuable.
Great, and I think if we go on to the next slide, then I was hoping to just set the scene a bit for X29. It probably, off the back of COP26, it won't come as a shock to say that, the world's facing a climate emergency. I think that's, broadly accepted. In the buildings and infrastructure sectors play a key role in that. And depending on what figures you look at, some would suggest that sector's responsible for over a third of global carbon dioxide emissions. Some of the main culprits being steel and cement, but the issue is much broader than that. And it's quite clear that the sustainability of creating and operating buildings and infrastructure, needs to, as we say on the slide, dramatically increase in order to get anywhere near our global climate change targets and aspirations. And it's certainly a key part of UK strategy. The UK government is committed to net zero greenhouse gases by 2050 and has set itself some of the most challenging interim targets of any country. And we've already seen the UK government starting to take steps to encourage its supply chain to focus on climate change. For example, the catchily titled PPN 0621 introduced the requirement for bidders for certain suppliers to have publicly available carbon reduction plans, which include a commitment to achieve net zero by 2050 at the latest. And you also see in the construction playbook, it underlines the importance of looking at whole life carbon footprint and the expectation that that will come into central government procurements going forward. So there's quite a lot going on, but we need to be mindful that this is a broad issue, and X29 isn't intended to be the full solution. It's part of the picture. And as we say on the slide, you need to consider your climate change objectives at procurement stage, I'd suggest.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point to highlight, that we don't believe that just simply including X29 in a contract is going to solve the problem. This is going to be only part of the whole creation of the asset process, going back from concept, trying to come up with solutions that maybe are no build or have take into account the use of carbon or the reduction in carbon usage throughout the design stage, and then into the construction stage where X29 can support, and then subsequently into the operation phase. So it's going to be part of a much bigger jigsaw, but we hope it's going to be an important piece moving forward.
Yeah, that's right, Ian. I think if you're only looking at climate change factors when you start drafting your contract, then it's really too late. It needs to be thought about before you launch your procurement process, I'd suggest, and then thinking about how the result of your procurement process will play into your contract. So X29 can perhaps be the way to hold a bidder to the promise that they make during procurement stage. But as you say, there's a much bigger bit of thinking that needs to come together to make this work. But X29 is hopefully a key part of that thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I don't think we want the situation where it's not been thought about enough. There's then a desire to try to reduce the carbon impact of the particular contract. And so a lot is put into X29 to try to drive or recover a position that should have been addressed earlier in the design process in the development of the scheme. So that is something to be mindful of. Okay, we move on to the next slide then. In terms of how we reduce the impact of the works on climate change, that is principally a technical issue, and that would therefore be addressed within the scope. The scope is contract specific, states what the contractor has to do, any constraints on how they do it. And a failure of the contractor to comply with the scope will be a defect that will require correction unless there's a mutual agreement to accept it. So there's a line of argument that says, well, we can address this issue through the scope. We can identify in the scope, what the contractor has to design to, what materials they should and shouldn't use, set performance criteria in a design and build environment. We can also specify how the contractor provides the works in terms of, green working methods, use of electric vehicles, etc. So on one side of it, you could say, well, just leave it to the scope. It's all going to be addressed there. But there's a concern that isn't going to be sufficient, that relies on users understanding what they need to include within the scope, and perhaps more importantly, how that scope will then link with the processes within the contract. So how does that link to the achievement of certain targets, link to payments, etc. So we do need to consider how we get this interaction working effectively between the scope and the contract procedures. I don't know, Stacey, from your perspective, do you see this as an issue that's commonly addressed through clauses within contracts outside of NEC?
Yeah, well, as a lawyer, I'm always going to say that the contractual clauses are important. I think the main advantage of using the contractual clauses is, as you say, Ian, to make sure the approach to climate change fits in with the wider contract, but importantly that the approach is compliant with the applicable law. And an important part of the contractual clauses is to make clear what each party's obligations are, and importantly what the consequences are, if any, of not meeting those expectations. And of course you're right, there's a strong technical element to that, to make sure you can deliver in a sort of climate beneficial way. But there's also a legal element to making sure both the client and the contractor are contractually committed to the relevant climate change objectives and targets in a way so that the risk allocation is, I guess, fair and transparent. And certainly we've already been seeing climate change type clauses appearing in some contracts, but there's such a lack of consistency of approach, often confusion about what should go in the technical documents, and you can spend a lot of time and effort and money, producing bespoke contract clauses and technical information specific to each client and project. That's obviously before you even try to agree them with the contractor.
I guess that key thing, isn't it, making sure that it fits together, the scope and the contractual clauses, procedures, risk allocation, reward mechanisms, etc., knit together so that we are driving achievement of what is set out in the scope, and we don't have procedures, processes that stop it being achieved or in some way disincentivize the achievement of what's set out in those technical documents.
Yeah, and that's the important point, isn't it, behind X29? And it'd be good to get the feedback on that. Is we're not trying to, it's not about punishing people and holding their feet to the fire. It's about trying to work together to achieve the climate objective in a way that incentivizes and rewards both parties if they get it right. I think. Would you agree with that, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the intent of it, and hopefully we can touch on that in some of the later slides when we look at some of the processes we've brought into the contract to exactly address that issue.
Yeah, no. Should we go on to the next slide then, which we've sort of touched upon already in terms of some of the thinking around why we felt a contract clause would be useful. I think a key part of dealing with climate change as a secondary option is to underline the importance of it, raise its profile. When using NEC, you'll need to consider, do you include X29 or not, which hopefully keeps in mind the impact of the relevant works, what that might be on the client's climate change ambitions. So in that way it can help drive forward thinking around the impact of the works on climate change in a general sense. But I think the hope is also that it will drive some consistency in the approach to addressing climate change issues in contracts. Hopefully X29, you'll agree, signposts some of the issues that need to be considered, and identifies what information you would want to see in the technical information to help deal with those issues, and tries to take things forward in a structured way. And as we said, incentivize performance against stretch climate change targets, and generally to embed this climate change thinking within the NEC's existing sort of ethos and procedures. And I think a key benefit will hopefully be wider use of the clauses in contracts of a variety of sizes and complexity, rather than being only seen in substantial and complex projects, which is perhaps what we're more commonly seeing at the moment. And if you'd agree with that, Ian.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a lot of it is around raising profile, making sure people are considering it, looking at ways of incentivizing achievement, and we'll touch on that when we look at some of the key aspects of the secondary option itself. And I think it's important to note that when we produced the secondary option, we actually went through every clause in the contract to look at how that would interact with X29. Is it something that we needed to address in the secondary option? For example, do we want to have early warnings being notified if we're not going to achieve climate change requirements? Well, yeah, absolutely. But then we also need to look at things like compensation events. How are they going to deal with the issue? Do we need to reference it? Do we need to have ways of making sure we maintain incentives around the climate change objectives? And so we've tried to make sure we've addressed all of the relevant clauses, but again, we welcome feedback as to whether people think we have or have not achieved that end. I think just moving on to the next slide and actually now getting into the overview of the option itself. The first thing we've done is introduced a concept of climate change requirements. These are stated in the scope and therefore are a part of the scope. And therefore, these are the things that the contractor has to achieve. Failure to achieve it would be a defect that will need to be corrected. So this sort of ties back to the earlier point that the majority of the requirements around climate change will be technical, will be in the scope. And this is providing the hook. I think the signpost, as Stacey referred to it earlier, into the relevant part of the scope where this issue should be addressed. It won't be addressed necessarily in isolation. There's going to be links to other things, but this is an area trying to focus the mind of those producing the scope on what it is they want to set as a minimum level for the contractor to achieve. And these requirements therefore have to be reasonable and achievable. If the contractor is going to be held to achieve these, we need to make sure they can be achieved and they're not going to place undue risk on the contractor. And as we've mentioned earlier, we don't want X29 to be a way of trying to recover a lack of thinking about climate change issues by putting that pressure onto the contractor to make up the shortfall in thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, Ian, as you say, because you can envisage a temptation, just put all of your sort of company's targets and objectives into the scope and sort of require the contractor to just align his works with that. And I think perhaps the hope is that there'll be more consideration than that goes into it, because I'd imagine a contractor would be very reluctant to accept such an undefined risk, or if he did, then they would certainly price for it perhaps and program for it, or as you say, Ian, may even pull out. And of course, if we think about what we're trying to achieve here, which is moving forward, climate change as a general concept and achieving our sort of wider objectives, then if your climate change requirements are just too vague, they're probably not going to be achieved. At best they might be ignored. At worst, there might be some falling out around that. So I think the hope is it will be quite a considered process how to make this work. And of course, you would hope this would evolve over time until we get to a place where it's pretty well understood how to make X29 work with a procurement process.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We don't want, if you go for what you think are very tough targets, that may actually be counterproductive. So you may not get people bidding, people including unnecessary amounts of risk. And the contractor may then be looking to sort of try to hit these targets at the expense of other things. And we still need a balanced approach to the overall delivery of the particular contract. Moving on to the next slide, another thing that we've introduced, and maybe this is where we sort of try and do this incentivization to try and do more than the standard, is we've introduced the concept of a performance table. It's been used in some of the other contracts in the NEC suite already, but here we're bringing it in specifically to address the issue of climate change, allowing the client to set targets that the contractor has to achieve. So these will be in addition to the climate change requirements. I think the expectation is there'll generally be sort of positive incentives to encourage improved performance, linked potentially to some sort of financial reward, a bit like key performance indicators, but specific to climate change. They may also be negative incentives. It may be that the contractor has made certain promises or commitments, and if there's a failure to achieve those, there will be a reduction in payment. But the idea is these are not things that would have to be rectified as defects. A failure to achieve it is addressed through the performance table. In the same way, improved performance is again addressed through the performance table. Where you have these financial incentives, there's also the ability within the performance table to cap them, to limit them. So particularly for negative incentives, the contractor may want to have some way of capping their exposure, limiting their liability, because it's worth noting that the performance table sits outside of the limitation of liability under X19. And so consideration needs to be given to any cap on the contractor's negative payments and also possibly on the client's positive payments in relation to the performance table. And I think a final point to note from me is that it could also be used without a financial incentive. The performance table could be used as a way of just monitoring and measuring performance against targets. You may have less mature clients, suppliers, not necessarily prepared to commit to hard cash, particularly while we're still evolving measurement criteria, etc., for carbon reduction and the like. And so the performance table could simply have targets. We measure performance, we report against it, but we don't necessarily put hard cash against it, at least initially. But maybe in later contracts, when suppliers get more comfortable, we can make it more financial in terms of its application.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I guess in a sense, it's important to read the market, I suppose, because it's going to be difficult to put something into your climate change requirements that has to be achieved. That, say, for example, is based on an untested methodology of working or technology. A contractor surely isn't going to accept that. But you might consider putting that same requirement into the performance table, because if you get the incentive right, it might encourage the contractor to take steps to give the untested approach a try, which may actually then lead to a better climate change outcome for the project. So I think it's for me, that's sort of really interesting to see what ends up going in the performance table and what ends up going in the climate change requirements. And I strongly suspect that will change as technology evolves in this space. But one of the areas that we talked about a fair bit when putting the clause together was how the insurance sector might view X29. And as you said, the performance table carved out of X18, potentially insert your own limitations in there. And we were sort of mindful that the insurance market post the Grenfell disasters hardened quite a bit. But I think inevitably, they're going to have to get on board with some element of, climate change risk being taken between the parties. And I think, they will be very interested in how X29 developed and how it's used. I don't know if you have a view on that, Ian, but yeah, really interesting sort of part of this puzzle to sort of keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we do think it's going to evolve over time. And, I think with both the climate change requirements and the content of the performance table, it obviously needs to be clear and concise. What are the targets to be achieved? What are the requirements to be delivered? We need to be able to sort of objectively assess whether it's happened. It needs to be measurable. We don't want to have vague statements, things that then are going to cause disagreements between the parties, because that's just going to be counterproductive anyway. But specifically in relation to climate change, where we should be trying to work together with a vested interest to mitigate the impact, rather than find ourselves, wasting time, effort, and energy arguing about unclear, difficult to measure or assess requirements or targets within the scope or the performance table.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose perhaps if we go on to the next slide, it's worth mentioning that we had in mind that it's likely that the climate change requirements and the performance table will be commonly developed and set by the client. And as we sort of touched upon, I guess it's important to think about that it is part of your procurement process thinking. So if you're going to tender the project or the works, is it going to be a pass fail that you accept the client's climate change requirements and the performance table, or will the contractor be able to propose different targets, and how will that work? Will they be developed in dialogue? And if it's not pass fail, then how would you assess the contractor's response to the climate change requirements, or the performance table? You know, and these aren't questions that X29 attempts to answer, but you know, sort of feel that they're important considerations to bear in mind. You know, and I think, as I said earlier, you know, the idea of this is perhaps where a successful bidder is promised to meet climate change requirements and to engage with, you know, performance table objectives. X29 is a way to hold them to that promise.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there will be, again, I guess, some developments, and it will evolve over how the climate change requirements are sort of set or developed. Is that going to be something that bidders are going to sort of add to or include, maybe as the contractor's scope for its design, they can add to, or, you know, put some further suggestions, or rather things to be achieved in terms of climate change requirements? Could we have a situation where bidders put forward the performance table and they specify their sort of commitments and what they're going to put on the table in relation to that, as maybe financial incentives and reductions? Though of course, you know, you'd have to very carefully consider the evaluation criteria around that, make sure there is a level playing field. And I think that will come, you know, further down the line, as we get that more maturity around it. And you know, maybe the performance table comes in contract data part 2 rather than contract data part 1 in schemes in the future. But again, we welcome feedback around that, and I think that's more going to be an evolution over time.
Yeah, and that's an important point, I think, about the X29 can be used sort of with different levels of maturity on the client side, because you don't have to use the performance table, as Ian said, or there might not be, you know, financial incentives or disincentives. It could just go in the climate change objectives, but there is the intent that it's a framework that can be used for relatively sort of straightforward approaches, but more sophisticated approaches as perhaps the market develops around this space of climate change thinking in relation to delivery of works.
Yeah, that maybe that leads on to the next slide and the next issue we want to pick up on, which is that X29, as with all of the NEC contracts, it's designed for use anywhere in the world for any type of work, services, or supply, or that's the ultimate aim. And so it's an enabler. It provides the tools to allow climate change requirements to be specified. It provides the ability to include a performance table, targets set within that, linked potentially to financial rewards. So it's going to require the clients to put the flesh on the bones to actually develop what those climate change requirements are. You know, the clients, their consultants and advisors, hopefully engaging contractors and subcontractors, but there's a need for the industry to help populate the content. So it may be that it varies depending on the type of work, the location, etc. But what NEC wants to do really is, as a follow-on from X29, is to start to engage with the industry, to start to help generate maybe some templates, some guidance over what could go in the climate change requirements, what could be set as performance targets in the performance table, how it can be measured and benchmarked compared to other bidders at tender stage, to other schemes being developed around the world. So, you know, I think we are going to look for the industry to help around this, and we can also, you know, help bring that together and start to publicize it. I mean, there's a wide variety of different organizations, initiatives underway. I think, Stacey, you're involved with some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. There's quite a lot of cross-industry groups already looking at providing frameworks and information to support the climate change transition. So, you know, bodies like the Construction Innovation Hub Value Toolkit, the ICE's decarbonisation initiatives, CBI's decarbonisation working groups, and many more. So I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to come together and provide the information to make X29 a success. As you say, one of the key challenges, Ian, is measuring. You know, you need to, if you're going to set a requirement or a target, you need to be able to measure that, and it's not a coincidence that that's one of the columns in the example for performance table in the guidance notes. I think at the moment we're seeing various different approaches to measuring the climate impact of different sort of methods of working and different processes and products. And it's probably fair to say there's limited consistency. So I guess that's where you look to the technical team to draw upon, what's best practice in the industry and what's being produced by some of these groups to help decide upon how particular measures should be measured, and to set that out clearly as part of the contract documents.
Yeah, I think that, again, we're looking for feedback around that. With the secondary option, it is written in as this enabler. The climate change requirements are blank. There's maybe a little bit of guidance on that. The performance table is blank. We did think about, do we start to actually populate these? Do we start to set some targets, some criteria? But the view was that, there's such variety, there's such different initiatives, different groups with different measurement criteria, etc., that we would leave it flexible, give the client complete flexibility over what they set as the climate change requirements and as the performance targets. But, it is going to be a bit of push and pull. We're going to need people to start putting the data in, then we can start to review it and maybe develop it, maybe start to develop some standards, and that may lead to changes to future iterations of X29. But the idea currently is to make it as flexible as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps if we go on to the next slide, sort of set out some bullet points and other aspects of the option. And if I perhaps take the last one first, because it dovetails with what you were just saying, Ian, in terms of the disclosure clause that we've added in, allowing for information related to climate change to be used, disclosed and publicised to others. That was in part recognising that many public and private bodies at the moment are either obliged to or voluntarily publicising the climate data relating to their sort of own businesses and processes. And in order to be able to do that, you need to obtain that information from your projects and supply chain, perhaps, and you need to have the ability to share that. So that's one part of it, but it was also potentially about sharing, best practice and what's working well, which might be important for bodies that might enter into a number of NEC contracts, wanting to be able to share what's worked and what hasn't worked with the counterparty, or in this case the contractor's consent, and that can be, the extent of the disclosure can be agreed in the climate change requirements. So that's an important part of the clause, I think. And then going back to the climate change execution plan, is mentioned to be issued and updated by the contractor, setting out how climate change requirements will be achieved, and the approach to the targets in the performance table. I don't know, Ian, if you could set up, a bit more information around what we'd expect to see in that.
Yes. So again, we've tried to be flexible. We allow for the content and the format of the climate change execution plan to be detailed in the climate change requirements. But the expectation is it's going to be a document that sets out the contractor's strategy for how they will achieve the requirements and the targets that have been set. So maybe identifying stakeholders or people to be engaged in the process, timescales, maybe the steps that need to be taken, the key milestones on the journey to achieve the requirements or targets, the tasks that are necessary to deliver that. And that's going to have to obviously be linked to other contract documentation like the program, maybe referring to dates when consents or acceptances are needed, interfaces with others who may have a role to play in this. So again, I think this will evolve over time. It's going to be elements of the client setting out some basic requirements, and I think then looking for the contractor to put the flesh on the bones. It's not dissimilar in some ways to a information execution plan around BIM, setting that strategy, picking up interface issues, how the achievement of the climate change requirements and performance targets will be delivered.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've also got a collaboration clause recognizing that the contractor may need to collaborate with others in order to achieve the climate change requirements, and that collaboration can be set out, whether it's by reference to specific companies or by particular work streams. And I guess it's worth highlighting that if you've got multiple delivery partners, then you might consider X12 as well, but you perhaps need to think quite carefully about how X12 would work alongside X29 to make sure that they sort of fit together correctly. So that's something to think about. And early warning is obviously important. Ian mentioned that earlier. If something's happened that's going to undermine the climate change requirements, then the client would want to know that so that it can be considered. So we thought that was quite a key part of sort of elevating the importance of these climate change matters within the contract.
And I think just picking up on that point around X12, I mean, X12, if it's selected, contains KPIs. There's also the potential to select X20 with KPIs, to have X17 low performance damages. So there's a number of secondary options that may sort of overlap with what we're doing in the performance table in X29. So some very careful consideration to using those options together. We wouldn't, for example, recommend you use low performance damages and KPIs with X29. This is going to cover both of those elements in one. And again, guidance is provided around that. So we do need to think about how the interaction will be between different sets of targets, KPIs, performance targets in the other secondary options. I think just moving on then to the next slide and looking at some of the other key aspects of the clause, we've introduced clauses to deal with impacts in relation to the performance table as a result of things like compensation events, the agreement to accelerate, or the acceptance of defects. Because where you have a performance table linked to financial incentives, there needs to be a way of updating those targets, the dates, the amounts within that performance table as a result of these events occurring, so that we maintain the incentive. We reflect the fact that maybe a target can't be met due to a change in scope or due to a delay that is as a result of a compensation event. And so we've introduced clauses to try to address that, to allow the incentive to be maintained. In terms of performance measurement, there's a requirement for the contractor to regularly report against its current and future achievement of the targets in the performance table. Frequency of those reports will be determined by the client in contract data part 1, but we would expect them to be fairly regular, fairly frequent, so as to give an early warning, if you like, of a failure to deliver against those performance targets, to give an opportunity to then put some measures in place to try to recover the position and still deliver the targets as outlined in the performance table. We've also introduced contractors' proposals, and we've written this in a pretty broad way. The logic being that we want to incentivize the contractor, we want to encourage the contractor to come to the table with good ideas that may reduce the impact of the works on climate change. And that's not just during its creation, it's also in terms of its future operation and maintenance, and ultimately its disposal, its demolition. So encouraging the contractor to come forward with good ideas, how can we reduce the impact, and giving them a reward for doing so.
Yeah, and I guess, Ian, it's perhaps recognizing that the technology and approaches to mitigate the climate change impact of of assets is fast moving, and we wanted to make sure that there was an incentive on the contractor to bring the latest solutions and technologies to the table. But of course, appreciating that sometimes a better climate change outcome can cost more, and I guess that's a balance the client will need to consider in relation to any proposal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe the contractor says, I've got a great idea. It will reduce by half the amount of embedded carbon in the finished asset, but it's going to double the price. And the client is going to have to take a view on the viability of that. Is it something that they can actually afford? I mean, I'm sure they're going to try to take these good ideas forward, but there will have to be some sort of viability test, some cost benefit analysis to see whether it is something that they can afford to pursue as an idea.
And is it worth touching upon, Ian, our thinking around, how the contractor's rewarded for these good ideas?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and we followed the sort of logic within X21 whole life cost, where because there's sort of a potential level of uncertainty over whether the contractor's proposals may actually deliver what is promised, particularly if it relates to future operation and maintenance or ultimate disposal, it's often quite difficult to come up with a mathematical calculation to predetermine the value created. I know there are initiatives about putting a value on a ton of carbon reduced, etc., but that's still somewhat in its infancy. So the idea was that contractor puts the proposal forward, project manager discusses it with the client. If they wish to proceed with it, they have to, in effect, buy the idea off the contractor. The project manager can't instigate the change unless they accept the contractor's quotation. And so the idea is there'd be hopefully a common sense grown-up conversation. Here's the potential reduction of impact. Here's the potential cost, because it may increase the cost of construction. And then here's what that means as a benefit to the client. And then how can the contractors share in that benefit? How can they be rewarded through some sort of payment? So we've left it open as a commercial conversation, but requiring the contractor's proposal to be accepted before the initiative, the proposal, can be instigated. Okay, just to close out then, and then we'll open the floor to questions. There's a few have come through already. In terms of next steps, as we've already said, please engage in the consultation process. Ends on the 13th of May. This will allow us to develop a final version of X29 that takes into account that feedback, hopefully delivers a better solution. We're going to develop a version of X29 for all of the main and subcontracts, or that's the current intent. As with all NEC clauses, there'll be guidance notes and flowcharts provided. And then, as we've touched on earlier, we're not going to sort of stop there. We're going to start to work with the industry to develop some examples, some template documents around the climate change requirements and targets for the performance table. And we're going to start that process at the users group conference on the 16th of June with some workshops to start this process of how we then build the content to support the secondary option. Okay, I think we'll now turn to the questions. We've got a number have come through the chat function. So first one is there much experience of using this as a Z clause in existing contracts? Now, Stacey, have you seen similar clauses in the contracts you've been working with?
Yes, in the sense that I've seen lots of different clauses around the general theme of climate change, but they tend to be either with very significant projects and very, very detailed, or to be almost like general boilerplate approach. So I perhaps haven't seen something as like X29, which is perhaps designed to be used on a broader range of projects by a broader range of people.
Yeah, I think certainly in terms of the people involved in producing X29, they brought their experience from their own organisations where they've seen similar clauses being used. Organisations like the Environment Agency, Highways England, or National Highways as it's called now, I think, using similar clauses. So we try to build on that. There's also some great work being done by organisations like the Chancery Lane Project, who are developing clauses. So, all of that thinking has been sort of taken into account, but we did sort of start with a clean piece of paper to address it from an NEC perspective, but then reflecting back on, what these other clauses are maybe trying to achieve.
Yeah, and perhaps a question I'll just pick out, Ian, if it's okay, because it links to this point, is because obviously I partly know the answer to this, did the panel consider publishing a guidance note as how to use how the same aims could be achieved using the standard clauses rather than producing X29?
Yeah, and we did, and that was, a starting point could have been a practice note. Here's how you can include it within the scope, how you can maybe use X17 to challenge low performance, reward good performance in X20. And we did work through that logic, but the feeling was that they maybe didn't fit together well enough, that there would have to be amendments made to them. Also, they didn't maybe cover the complete picture around early warnings, compensation events, etc. So the view was that we should produce something new, and particularly that we should, use that as a way of also highlighting the issue, raising the profile, and again, getting people to recognize it as a specific thing that we have to consider in contracts going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And what other point that we touched upon earlier, but I think we could expand upon, is what the plan is to roll this into the other NEC forms.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And again, maybe as part of the feedback, it would be interesting to hear views on this because, for example, with X21 whole life cost, that features in the construction contracts and also the service contracts in respect of the facilities management contract, in respect of the term service contract, but it doesn't feature in the professional service contract. The idea being that consultants in developing designs, providing their service, should already take into account whole life cost. Is there a similar viewpoint here? Should, under professional services contract, the designers should already be designing out carbon, designing solutions that have the lowest impact on the environment, and so we don't need to target that in those contracts? Or if we don't do that, are we missing something? So that again would be useful feedback to receive as part of the consultation process.
And I think we were also considering, in terms of the short forms, whether you would have an equivalent to X29 in the short forms, or whether you would leave it to be dealt with in the scope via a guidance note or somewhere in between. I think that was something that we were keen to get some views on.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we tried to keep the short contract simple, and yet we have in the facilities management short contract introduced the option for a performance table. So do we want to have a similar option in the other short contracts around a performance table specifically targeting sustainability, or is that going to overcomplicate them? I think maybe having it as an option may be the balance to be struck, but again, feedback around that is going to be useful as part of that consultation process. Just looking at the other questions, a question came through around whether the climate change execution plan should be linked to withholding of 25% of the price for work done if the contractor fails to submit one. And we did discuss this, if you recall, Stacey.
Yes. Yeah, I think we thought quite hard about that, but decided that wasn't the right approach that we wanted to take with the X clause. That's right, isn't it? And I suppose it's also a reflection of, as we talked about, the maturity of the market. It's going to take a while for everyone to find their feet on what this needs to look like.
Yeah, I mean, it was a consideration. The view was that with the program, yes, we have a 25% withholding amount in terms of the price for work done to date until a first program is submitted for acceptance. But we didn't follow that through into things like the quality plan and quality policy statement that needs to be submitted under core clause 4. We didn't follow that through in terms of withholding money if there's a lack of a information execution plan to be provided. And so we thought it was probably overkill in this respect. If a client is so keen to get a climate execution plan in place, then they could include it as part of the tender process, get it bound into the contract award. If it's going to be sent afterwards, then I think we see it as being more beneficial to both parties to have it, contractor hopefully wanting to do it to show how they're going to achieve things. And so we felt that it was overkill to have that. But again, that can be part of the consultation process and feedback received.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one practical point that I've lost the question, but somebody had asked about where they can find the consultation documents and whether these shares will be shared, whether these slides will be shared. Do you want to comment on that, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, we can make the slides available, but we are recording the session, so you can always go back and look at the recording, and you can, read the slides again. And obviously, I think it's easier when they're brought to life with the content behind them being articulated. As I say, the guidance notes, the secondary option itself is a free download. It's accessible to anybody, so we would encourage people to use this opportunity to look at it and comment upon it.
Yeah, I guess we could add the link or the web address onto the slides, couldn't we, if it's not already there?
Yeah. Richard Patterson has asked a question.
You should know the answer to.
Yep. Do the climate change requirements have to be in only an explicit part of the scope, or can they be littered around the scope? It's an interesting question, and I suppose one again that we may need to develop over time an answer. I mean, the idea is to provide that hook to where that information is contained, but it is going to overlap. It is going to, possibly interrelate to performance criteria for design. So again, that may be something we need to consider as part of the consultation process. The idea, as I say, it's the scope is the scope. We're just signposting to a part of it. So I don't think it really matters if it's spread around, because it's still scope. It still has to be achieved, but at least we have a signpost to where specific matters relating to climate change can be addressed.
Yeah, and perhaps if I can come in on that, I guess the lawyer in me wants it to be clear exactly what is intended to be, climate change related or part of the climate change requirements, and what isn't, so everybody knows where they stand on what they need to achieve. And that also goes to the future improvements and the contractor making proposals. If we're all clear on what the baseline is, then we can make improvements against that. One comment I wanted to, sorry, go on. I just wanted to pick this question up because it's quite an interesting one. Is in terms of the performance table targets, is the expectation that they'll only be related to the build phase rather than addressing operational issues? I suppose just before you come in on that, Ian, I guess I was just thinking, well, actually, there's no reason why it couldn't cover some things in the operational stage, other than the practicality of how you would deal with that. And if you dealt with it outside, if it could only be measured outside of the defects period, then how would that work? So that might be something. I don't know if you've got a thought on that, Ian.
Yeah, I think, obviously we do have a design, build and operate contract where you could then link together the construction with the operation. You could then have climate change requirements, performance targets that operate on more of a whole life asset basis. Though if you're just using, say, the ECC for construction, then it's often difficult to then hold the contractor to post performance. I mean, you've got defects, etc., that go through to the defect state. You may have then sort of latent defects under the applicable law, but often it's difficult to sort of hold someone responsible for later failures or a lack of achievement, because is it down to design and construction, or is it maintenance? Is there intervening events that have stopped it being achieved? So, something to consider, but I think that is quite a challenge to try and link it post the responsibility of the contractor under the ECC, as an example.
Absolutely. I'm conscious of time, Ian. I don't know if you want to close it there or to come.
Sorry, and I think we do need to sort of wrap things up. I mean, obviously we've got a lot of questions there, and what we can do is we can make a note of the questions that haven't been answered, and then we can try to provide a response to those. I think just a couple of questions that were asked we can answer fairly quickly. If we're going to have X29 and the climate change requirements as part of the scope, why not make it part of the core clauses? that may be where it evolves. The idea now is to have it as a bolt-on, but it may be that over time, yeah, it becomes common business, you know, it's the day-to-day, and it becomes part of the core clauses. And there was another question around, you know, lots of different clients setting lots of different targets. Will that be an issue for the industry? And yeah, there's a risk of that. And it's something that I think we recognize, hence the desire to try to get some working groups, some people together to try to create some examples, some templates, maybe some standard targets to be achieved. But it's difficult. Lots of different organizations, different initiatives, different priorities. So that's something I think is going to have to evolve over time. And yeah, hopefully there will be a consistency of approach to make the supplier's life easier in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps it's a bit like BIM, where you look at where we were 5 years ago to look at where we are now. It's much better understood and a lot more clarity over what's needed to make it work. So hopefully it'll evolve quickly.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. So thank you everybody for your attendance. Thank you for the questions and interaction. Apologies if we didn't get a chance to answer your question. As I say, we'll take them away and try and come up with some responses that will be shared. I'd like to thank Stacey for your contributions and engagement today, the rest of the team that I mentioned earlier for helping to produce it, and the support we've received from the NEC4 Contract Board and the NEC and ICE more generally.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.